Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a new podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we'll talk to experts about a variety of topics and why it matters for U.S. foreign policy. Today we are joined by Tim Ball, a Senior Fellow at FPRI in the National Security Program and a Special Forces Officer, about the role of SOF in great power competition and the Biden national security agenda. Enjoy the discussion. Hello and welcome. Today we are talking with Tim Ball, a Special Forces Officer and an FPRI Fellow in the National Security Program. Tim, it's nice to see you and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Aaron.
I think this is the second time we've had you on the show, so it's good to welcome you back and good that you were able to make time to chat. So thanks for doing this. Sure thing.
Excited to do it.
Before we get rolling here, I just need to read out the obligatory disclaimer that the views here do not represent those of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Department of Defense, or any part of the U.S. government. With that out of the way, the things that we wanted to talk about tonight was we obviously have a change in administration that took place. We're recording this on Monday, January 25th, so 5 days ago. With President Biden coming in, we've seen a wave of confirmations of his cabinet. Most pertinent to this podcast is the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. And both he and Biden are certainly going to oversee a review of the priorities of U.S. defense priorities and defense commitments around the world. But I think it's pretty fair to say that even if the name is changed, there's going to be some sort of emphasis, or the main emphasis, I should say, will be on this idea of great power competition and U.S. planning for potential combat with a peer adversary. So, Tim, before we jump into the conversation, I think it's just best if we just roll through a little bit about how you think about and conceptualize great power competition, because the term is a little bit amorphous and nebulous, and it's kind of choose your own adventure in terms of how you want to interpret it.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I absolutely agree with you. I don't think I don't even think you're going to have a renaming convention. Great power competition, I think, is still going to be the flavor of the Biden administration, at least initially. All indicators point towards them still viewing Russia and China as sort of the primary threats toward the U.S. Now, where you got to kind of dive off from there is, is great power competition solely a military thing? And the answer is, of course not. We learned at a very young age in the Army, there's multiple instruments of U.S. power, and the military is just one of them. And great power competition will certainly involve all. And I think you've seen some initial indicators from the Biden administration that they're going to put a lot of emphasis on the diplomatic side. I think, a re-emphasis on the State Department and sort of getting after the diplomacy. For the military side, what you're carrying over is from the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And you kind of took a snapshot of that, and we talked about things like overmatch in that National Defense Strategy. And overmatch was a concept in which you basically build a military that's so big and technologically advanced that nobody would ever mess with you. It's a form of deterrence. It's also very expensive, and it requires you to invest quite a bit into your military budget. And as we're probably already seeing, the budget's going to be, back in the purview of Congress, and you're going to see less of a willingness, I think, from the Republican side of the aisle to continue pumping money into the government. So one way or the other, you're probably going to see a little bit of a drawback on how much the military is getting. So that kind of circles back to, what is great power competition when it comes to the military. Right now, some would argue that it's really preparing for that large-scale combat operation that you're talking about, a fight with Russia or China, peer-to-peer, just all-out war. But I've argued that that's not necessarily the case. Great power competition actually continues to happen every single day through certain military elements that are on the ground forward. And my big argument was that Special Operations Forces in particular have been doing this for a long time. Great power competition isn't anything new in the soft world. We've been out there, even, when Iraq and Afghanistan were really, really hot and heavy. We were still in other corners of the world doing great power competition.
That's a good point, because, as I said, the term is amorphous, and a lot of people conceptualize it both budgetary in terms of buying high-end items and the allocation of finite dollars towards things that you would conceptually use for that overmatch to ensure that you retain that edge against a peer adversary. But also in scenario planning for sort of like big red on blue, big types of set pieces of conflict for how you think and conceptualize this. But I'm wondering if like we're going back to the future here, which is like as we focus on sort of that high end stuff, is that there's less emphasis on sort of relationship building, the sort of the core bread and butter of what SOF does for maintaining U.S. partnerships and alliances around the world, and how that fits into maybe sort of indirect great power competition, for lack of a better word, for how the U.S. can compete with its peers.
Yeah, and I think you said it right when you said Back to the Future. Former Secretary of Defense, CIA Director Bob Gates wrote an article where he argued that, hey, we've already done this. We've already done great power competition. We did it during the Cold War, and we did it without really firing a shot against the Soviet Union. All the competition that occurred was really at the peripheries. It was, through proxy forces, proxy wars in some cases. You saw our efforts in Afghanistan when the Russians invaded there, the Russian efforts in Vietnam when we were engaged there. So you've seen this before. But what the kind of the common thread that's going to continue, we may not be jumping into another Vietnam. We may not be jumping into another Iraq, but the competition for influence in all these corners of the world is still going to be a key part of great power competition. And that's what I think, SOF really brings to the table, because even in the absence of conflict, you do have special operations forces that are constantly forward, building these relationships and building these partnerships. And when you do those kind of contributions, that's what starts to build you influence in these areas of the world.
The image that SOF conjures up, particularly in the post 9/11 era, is one of the direct action mission. It's like perhaps memorialized or immortalized in very well-sourced New Yorker articles and movies like Zero Dark 30, is like your role is to always be that pointy end of the spear to kick in the door and go do your thing against terrorists or potential adversaries of the U.S. But I think what you're saying is perhaps the direct action mission is something that has to be like not unlearned, but not be the top priority moving forward, because it's not exactly how great power competition will play out.
Well, I mean, direct action can certainly be part of great power competition. Counterterrorism itself, one of the SOF missions, still has a role in great power competition, but it's not the only thing. And direct action is simply a set of skills that you're applying in a certain way. When you're working these different partnerships and you're out there doing other SOF missions, let's call it foreign internal defense, you're teaching direct action skills to your partners. And then you certainly get situations like Afghanistan and Iraq where you actually get to conduct direct action with your partners. Now, you're right that, we've kind of seen through the movies and through the books that have been written, it's a big emphasis on the direct action side of things. And that's what people have associated with SOF. But it's just patently false that that's all that SOF does. Even during the surge in Iraq, when things were just really, really hot and heavy, and there's a lot of partnered direct action going on with SOF forces in Iraq, you still had SOF in other corners of the world doing partnerships. And it wasn't always all about direct action. That's just not, you would call it not as sexy, I guess. The direct action is the sexy side of things. But what gets much less attention is building these partnerships and the everyday grind of being out there with a partner force in the absence of conflict.
That's interesting. Because when we think about this, even the partner operations has kind of been morphed by current circumstances. When you say partner operations, the first thing that flashes across my brain, and it may be because it's my area of study, is Syria, actually. And it's kind of like the ISIS conflict. And the ISIS conflict is often held up as the potential template for small footprint operations to replace to use the term forever war. So you don't need to do the level of conflict that you see in Afghanistan or that you saw in Iraq, but you can slim it down and you can do something like what we saw in northeastern and eastern Syria. But I think what you're saying is that that can be a part of it. But even that, for me, even that sort of comes back, in my mind at least, to that direct action mission and less to sort of the daily grind of not going out on raids, but ultimately teaching people how to do foreign internal defense. And I think that maybe is worth emphasizing a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, even the example that you brought up with Syria and Iraq, and the clearance of ISIS and the defeat of the caliphate, you had U.S. SOF on the ground consistently and conventional forces. It wasn't just SOF. We did have conventional forces that were partnered with the Iraqi army, and then, again, SOF across the border with the SDF. They weren't necessarily getting into direct action contact every single time with their partners. A lot of the time, the partners were pushed forward because of the restrictions that had been put into place. And you've written about this. And so there is a level of, even when it's direct action, even when something is happening, it's not necessarily that SOF is engaged. Sometimes you're enabling a partner force. And that's a really important distinction as well, because it's another thing that SOF does very, very well, is you can sit back and a mature partner force like the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service, CTS, Army Special Forces have been working with them since 2004. It's been a long time. They built that force, really just worked with them year after year after year. And those guys are really good at what they do. And so with just a little bit of help from American SOF, they can get on target by themselves. It is exactly what you want as a special operator, is you want to see your partner force be able to operate without you. You've built that capacity now to help them get out and get after it by themselves.
One of the things is like, I'm going to bring it full circle because, I do think that one of the main components of great power competition or GPC is, I think that China is the top priority. But I do think that there will be a specific emphasis placed upon renewing American alliances. Biden said it in his inaugural address. Sort of his only line on foreign policy was about like sort of America is back. That implies that particularly with America's European allies is that sort of let's say the rough and tumble way that the Trump administration handled them is sort of a thing of the past, and we're back to the big hug, even if sometimes we disagree.
Well, I was going to say, who was Secretary Austin's first phone call? He sent it straight to the NATO Secretary General. So I think that's an immediate signal to the alliance. And for better or worse, the Trump administration wasn't real big on the NATO alliance. Now, you certainly had folks within the administration that tried to keep that partnership alive, even as a lot of the bluster was going back and forth. But President Trump he didn't try to hide it. He did not like the alliance. So I think it was an important signal sent by the Biden administration to say, hey, we want to kind of call it mend fences. They want to kind of get back to the way things were with the alliance. And part of that is continued partnerships, and that's not just through SOF. You'll see conventional forces working with each other across the alliance as well. Conventional forces in Eastern Europe working with Polish partners, providing reassurance for our allies on the Eastern Front there. And it's very, very important. And that alliance, that's really what keeps Russia at bay. What is Russia, stopping from just going across the border into an Estonia or into a Lithuania or Latvia? It's the alliance. The alliance is waiting there behind it to say, hey, we're not going to tolerate that. And they've made that pact openly through Article 5, saying, hey, an attack on them is an attack on all of us, and we will respond. So reemphasizing those partnerships, if you want to compete with Russia and you want to keep Russia at bay, then the alliance is the key to doing that. And the key to the alliance is maintaining those partnerships through consistent engagement abroad.
Right. And so one of the things that was held up as sort of like this sort of centerpiece of the American commitment. Again, this is out of area. It's not particularly in the alliance, but sort of alliance adjacent. And here I'm talking about Ukraine, which is the Obama administration's hesitancy to provide, the Javelin anti-tank missiles, versus the Trump administration's acquiescence to that request. But I think that the more important and more salient part is, that durable relationship that SOF was playing well before the Trump administration in terms of that thing about, the emphasis that you were talking about was building partnerships and how that may be more durable and more sustainable and sort of a good example of the not so bright and shiny part of great power competition, but something that's important nonetheless to building and cultivating new partners.
Yeah, if you want to talk about the Ukraine example, we can talk about the power of the military advisor. You can send Javelin missiles and you can send sniper rifles anywhere you want to, but if you don't have the training to utilize those weapon systems, then they're really worthless. They can sit and collect dust. They're not going to be able to be employed in a manner that's really, does anything for you. What is powerful is sending military advisors to places to build that partner capacity I was talking about. And with the Ukraine piece, again, it's not just SOF. You've got National Guardsmen that are over there providing a good cadre, working, Ukrainian battalions through their training center. And as they do that, you're not only increasing their lethality, but you're also providing things like medical training, which increases their survivability on the battlefield. So when the initial conflict started, you had some gaps in knowledge from basic trauma medicine on the battlefield, and American advisors were able to kind of provide that. And these guys took it back to their units. It was sort of a train the trainer mentality, and that spreads. So you can start teaching people how to do basic battlefield medicine. That increases your survivability. And it's just important. And so these partnerships, they continue to pay off down the road. A weapon system can be used, it can be used accurately, and then it's gone. But that partnership, when you start teaching those skills and building that capacity, it lasts, and it can continue to grow and grow and grow as the unit that you teach teaches it to other units.
So, as we pivot to sort of the wrap up here, if you could just encapsulate a little bit, because, there are all these articles written. I've read them. I'm sure you've read them. I'm sure they've been passed around, which is what is the role of Special Operations Forces. At a time when you think about that big conflict, sort of the big blue versus the big red, fold the gap style, you smash yourself. And so what is the role for these small units? And I think what you're saying is perhaps that image or perhaps that assumption about what it will look like is the fallacy. That's not the right way to look at it. But this is that this will be sustained, this will be open-ended, so that there is a role for trying to cultivate new partners, or at least to maintain partnerships moving forward, and so that there is a role for these sort of not flashy things per se, but sort of like it's not boring, but the boring stuff. I'm doing air quotes. People can't see me, which is just the basic day-to-day stuff of enabling a partner force.
Yeah, I mean, that is the everyday role of Special Operations Forces, especially Army Special Forces. Everyday role is getting out there and building those partnerships. Those partnerships pay dividends. If the balloon ever goes up and we find ourselves in a big conflict with Russia, we better hope that we've got all of our partnerships in line with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, that those are firm, we've got good communication with them, and that we can talk across the net to each other, because that's what's going to drive the Russians back across the border. So is it boring? I would argue no. I think it's actually quite a bit of fun to get out there and train with partner forces and see these areas of the world. It's a reason why a lot of us signed up for Special Operations Forces, is to get to go to see different places. But it does pay dividends in the end. And so while we may not be able to say, hey, SOF is the lead element if we ever get that conflict that you're talking about, certainly not. If conventional forces go at it, SOF will play a role, and it's going to be a supporting one. And that's okay. But in the meantime, in the absence of that conflict, SOF is very much still the tip of the spear. They're still out there building those partnerships, still out there building that capacity, and building those relationships and making sure that we know what's going on around the world.
I guess maybe the final question is that, how big is the cultural change for you guys? It is quite clear that we've had basically 3 successive administrations: Obama, Trump, Biden. And I would say that both Biden and Obama probably don't like Trump very much, and I think the feeling is mutual. And I think that there is differing sorts of political ideology that goes into this. And obviously there's different conceptions of the American role in the world and the role of alliances. But I think one thing that the 3 men would agree on, even if their logic in getting there would be different, is the necessity of winding down conflicts in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, and particularly in Afghanistan. And they may differ on the number of troops and how you wind it down, but it more or less is this is a bad idea, this was a bad idea in 2003, and it's time to end this thing.
There's a wonderful book written by Dr. Andrew Basovich, who's actually a retired full colonel from the Army, America's War for the Greater Middle East. And it's one of the best sequential just sort of timelines of our engagement in the Middle East, dating back to the Carter administration and before. And what he points out is that you've had different administrations come along, very opposing political ideologies, and yet for some reason we have remained very, very engaged in the Middle East. So I will always argue that I don't think it's going away. That being said, the deployments of the mid-2000s and even the recent deployments to Afghanistan, those are going away. We're not going to see it as much, and we're not going to see that high-end kinetic action that SOF was doing for almost 20 years. So in terms of, does that change your mindset? Absolutely. There has to be, and that's across the entire military, not just in SOF. The conventional military was training for years to go and spend 15 months trying to do counterinsurgency operations. They're back to training for large-scale combat operations. SOF knew that they were going in to work with high-end counterterrorism forces doing direct action kinetic activity. Some of that is changing to where we're back to all the other missions that I was talking about that we've been conducting in and around Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's just going out and that's training basic combat skills to partners. So you are going to have to see a little bit of a mind shift. There's been a lot written on it, on whether SOF is able to embrace it. And I would just let you know that, there's plenty of guys within the community that completely understand the strategic nature of what they're doing as they go build those partnerships. And they understand while it may not be as flashy as going and kicking doors, it's just as important. And those guys are in important leadership positions. They're influencing the younger generations as they come in. Guys are still signing up. They're still coming into the force, and they're just learning that, hey, there's multiple sides of SOF, and direct action is just one small piece of what we get to do. And quite frankly, for the younger guys that worry about maybe missing the heydays, there's probably going to be opportunity down the road. They don't need to worry for too long. There tends to be conflict, and as much as we try to do to stop it, it happens. And so these younger guys that maybe miss the heydays of Iraq and Afghanistan, there's going to be more for them down the road. And the older guys teaching them the skills that they learned over those 20 years is just as important. So you keep translating those skill sets and transferring them, and guys carry it forward with them.
It's sustained combat for 20 years must have seriously influenced how you guys think about things, or am I totally misreading this?
No, I mean, you're right. And it absolutely, you learn and you learn and you learn. But what's just really important in this business is that everything that you learn doesn't necessarily apply from scenario to scenario. And you got to take bits and pieces and figure out what works and where it works. And again, knowing the AO, knowing the terrain, knowing the people, guys doing multiple rotations and falling back in on the same partnerships that they'd had the year before. Very just important stuff. But the skill sets learned, the skills developed, the tactics developed, all of that is going to be carried forward. And, for the right partner forces, it also gets taught to them. The lessons we learned in Afghanistan, Iraq, those will go forward. And don't forget, we're not the only ones that were fighting there. You have a whole lot of folks from the NATO alliance that were fighting with us shoulder to shoulder, learning the same pieces, and they're taking that back as well. Can't say enough about how much was learned and how much will be carried forward.
Well, as we wrap up here, any final words? It just sounds like one of the things I try to drive home is that we just have to update our assumptions about what this may look like in terms of great power competition with the Russians, competition with the Chinese, but I tend to focus more on the Russian side because of my area of focus. And if this is going to be long and it's going to be open-ended, sort of that non-direct action piece, but that equally important, partnership, cultivation, relationship grooming is just such an important thing. And it's something that falls between the spectrum of that direct action piece and that doing nothing piece, and I just hope that it's not dismissed as doing nothing because it doesn't necessarily make headlines every single day.
No, absolutely. And there's multiple aspects to great power competition. I think that's how we started the conversation. And in the absence of conflict, I argue that SOF has an extremely important role doing those things and getting out front and having that forward presence to provide the nation with partnerships and with information. And it's going to be something that continues. It's something that SOF does very, very well. And I think we've gone this entire podcast without using the term gray zone or phase zero. And I'm going to throw it out there in the end, just in case one certain old professor I had listening, he's going to love the fact that I use gray zone. But, we use multiple terms for it. For what's that area, outside. It is. If you're listening to Dr. Whiteside, shout out to you. One of my favorite profs of all time.
It's a good guy. But yeah, he's been on this podcast.
But yeah, we just want to make sure, that's the area that we operate in very, very well. And, you can define it in any way you want to. Call it day-to-day, steady-state operations. That is where SOF thrives. It's where we're at. And we're going to continue to be out there building those partnerships for the country.
Well said. And Tim, thanks as always for joining. And it was a pleasure chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I hope to see y'all again soon.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.